prepare for that. So CMI, again, is that experiential approach. It's an experiential psychotherapy where the clinician is going to work to guide the client on an internal journey. So when we say internal, we're talking about the interoceptive, the experiential. And the idea is to focus on these signals. That's a key word in CMI, the signals that come from the body, the sensations of the body, and the emotions, and the kind of the blending of these phenomena, sensory, emotion. And we use sensation and sensation emotion as a starting point and the path. Really, the journey happens in these experiential areas. And by expanding sensory emotion experience, we can really move into these places where what we use the term critical memory exists. The CMI approach does help clients access these critical memories, and I'll unpack that here in a moment. Those critical memories are and can be thought of as these significant life experiences that are going to shape a great many things. They're going to a sort of like automatic process or worldview or way of interacting. It shapes a perception of reality. It influences how an individual, in a sort of a procedural, automatic way, is going to relate to the world, to others, to themselves. We could think of critical memories as being discrete in some sense, like a discrete event can contribute to a critical memory or install a critical memory. But they can also be these networks of experiences and events. One can make a quick comparison to a thing like a discrete trauma or complex trauma. Both of those are subsumed under our conceptualization of what critical memory is. So looking at why develop CMI, I was kind of alluding to that a little bit at the beginning. Why develop CMI? One of the things we want to do is, well, many of the things we want to do is address these concerns that folks are and providers are running into. But also the idea is to provide something to the client that's useful, that's helpful. So just to start with, developing CMI is a means to offset that feeling that we sometimes get in therapy, depending on the modality that we're using, where the treatment doesn't feel connected. It feels disconnected from the needs of the client, or the client isn't connecting to the therapy. So we want to address that. We want to address the relationship interference, so the client-therapist relationship, that alliance, that very special, sacred component of healing that comes from the connection, the relationship between the therapist and the client. So the ways in which other modalities can sort of interfere with that relationship, CMI really aims to amplify and to boost that connection. Those feelings of being stuck in a process with the client, within the therapist's own feeling of being stuck within themselves. What do I do about this? I don't know what to do about what is being presented here to me. From the client, I feel stuck, or maybe the client feels stuck. So addressing this feeling of being stuck, CMI has a very, in a sense, succinct and direct way to move through those stuck feelings. It's meant to be a one size fits, and there's no one size fits all. But as much as we can in looking at the development of CMI is to see where are these things coming from a biological and neurophysiological and sociological basis. How do we understand these things? And can we meet those constituent parts that are consistent across human experience? And so in so doing, we find that it fits a much broader range of presentations. And then CMI is also developed to kind of shift the idea of alleviating symptoms into a growth mindset. So to not just reduce the distress and impairment, which is how we kind of get folks in the door, they're distressed, they're impaired, they're not functioning, but to focus on and to really shift the game plan from reducing the distress to increasing the well-being and the growth of the individual. CMI really focuses on that. And then it provides the client with this capacity to own their health, their growth, their well-being. The therapist isn't such a key player in all of this. The therapist isn't so necessary. The therapist becomes a mentor in a sense where the client, the hero in the sense, can advance in their story, where the therapist is only sort of a side character, so to speak, to give them something of value, something useful in the CMI process. But they really are able to grow in a sense that they can continue the CMI process on their own. So we will, and I didn't say this at the beginning of the onset, but I want folks to know that the chat feature is there. And if there are any questions, throw them in chat because we'll get to them toward the end. We definitely want to answer every question, though some of the slides may answer questions as we go. So feel free to utilize that. So looking at some of the contributing, let me just check this real quick, Stephanie. Yeah, very good. You're actually you kind of set up my next slide. So let's just look at some of the contributing modalities. So much of what went into CMI and the development was the effort of a group of folks who were very well seasoned and experienced across a great many modalities and interests in neuroscience and that sort of thing, looking at some of the things that could possibly work in integrating these things in a way that is everything plays nice, everything flows, everything fits in such a way that it's like a natural, organic, if you will, process. And so we look at things here on the left, we look at things like our theories, our neuroscience, our biology, just sort of the research, the constituent parts of the human experience. Those are in that left column. And then on the right, you can see a great many other different kinds of therapies. I would put ACT in there. I would put acceptance and commitment there. I would put positive psychology. In fact, a lot of the stuff that the ACT folks and the positive psychology folks are doing in this sort of third wave cognitive approach is, very much in the same trajectory that CMI is hoping to do, to advance beyond some of the more cognitive behavioral efforts, which do seem to have limitations, and to get more at the whole person. So that's a great question. But you can just see so much has gone into CMI that exists out there already. What makes CMI different? You look at all those things that are going into CMI and it says, okay, well, what distinguishes it? What makes it different from these other approaches? I might boost the font on that a little bit. Hope folks can see it. Some of the font will go back and forth because I've got a lot of content. But one of the things that can be sort of put out in front as a distinction, because there are a lot of common factors. There are a lot of common factors between therapies. One of the things we want to really emphasize in CMI is that the process of extinction as a mechanism or a technique or a phenomena for reducing symptomology and distress, this extinction process is one where the therapist and the therapy would endeavor to reduce the impact or the effect of some, and I'll insert a CMI word, critical memory, so some sort of like automatic response, to reduce the effect of that through different techniques or strategies, like a Socratic process. Okay, I'm feeling this negative emotion, does it make sense? So I engage a Socratic process. The idea there being is that over time, that negative emotion, or that uncomfortable emotion, would go away. It would extinguish because it doesn't get reinforced through attention and behavior and that sort of thing. So that's an extinction process that a lot of therapies use. What CMI does, it's very different, and some other therapies are in the same trajectory, is this idea of expansion. So when that negative emotion shows up, instead we would move toward it instead of trying to manage it or develop some parallel process that we could engage to reduce the impact or the experience of that negative emotion. CMI says no, head into that negative emotion, that uncomfortable emotion or sensation is a signal. That's a CMI term. That's a signal that we want to listen to approach, to move toward, to value. And so this leads right into the next idea in the difference between explanation and experience. A lot of therapies and approaches, and even the way that we're taught as therapists, is to engage the sort of dialectic, the Socratic, the conversational, the cognitive processes of exploring through conversation what somebody is going through, what their experience is. And there's a lot of value in that. There's nothing in CMI that would say that that is not valuable, but to an extent. Where CMI wants to distinguish itself is that when we can, and when it's appropriate to do so, to shift to the experiential, to take that sensation and to shift all of one's attention, intention, so kind of the mindfulness ideas, to move into that sensation of a difficult sensation and to expand it, to actually increase its impact, to increase its felt sense, to increase its information, like what it brings. And so with CMI, we're developing, we've developed that sort of different approach of moving toward. And there are some techniques, positive psychology being one that does something similar to this. The exact terminology escapes me right now, but again, that kind of lends to some of the evidence base that we'll get to later. So we want to move into experience. And then and this isn't a huge distinction, because I think a lot of folks would immediately recognize that well-being and growth and the development of the individual is incredibly important. And a lot of the sort of traditional, not so much conventional, but the traditional approaches did really have this, some like the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic and some of the humanistic approaches do see the well-being versus pathology as a good distinction to make. CMI does it, and we're trying to bring that back in a way that's consistent with, updated and modern research literature. So that's another distinction to point out. Let's talk about what is a critical memory. You've heard that term. It's in the name, critical memory. How do we define this? So critical memories, these are things that shape our perception of reality. They're going to be past experiences. They're stored in memory traces and networks that are often operating outside of our conscious awareness. And these memory networks they're many. So it's not just one, like an episodic memory network. You think of an episodic memory, it's something that most people sort of recognize as memory, which is, I recall a distinct event where I was there and I was doing things. Memory is a lot more than that, as you know, and these critical memories extend beyond just those memory networks. So there's a lot of procedural memories, or the automatic stuff. You think of the sort of van der Kolkian idea of the body holding memory, and in some sense, that's a useful analogy. The way that the memory is stored in the sensation components, the sensation parts of us, and how that informs our mood and affect and cognition and behavior and emotion and so much. So we think of memory, the critical memory, as extending across these memory networks. But they're very important in guiding how we interact with the world. They're important for helping us with survival, for social engagement. They act like a policy and procedural manual. So this automatic thing that we got to execute this function, we got to do it this way. Critical memories don't always have to be traumatic. They don't always have to be like this negative thing. Critical memory can be thought of something that is useful and helpful given the context or the situation, circumstance. We also want to make the distinction that a critical memory could also represent something that's no longer helpful, maybe outdated, it's no longer effective. You can think of a soldier coming back from a wartime environment, and the way they're behaving and reacting now is very different from what it was helpful. It's no longer helpful. And so you've got this sort of outdated system, this outdated sort of, or maybe it doesn't fit. And so critical memories can also extend into these places that become maladaptive very quickly, become detrimental very quickly in the human experience. We also want to make the point that a critical memory can be conceptualized as this literal thing, but also like this figurative thing. So, figurative is going to be useful for communicating. The figurative idea is that the critical memory holds a incident or a set of experience which define a part of the past that might be out of sync with the present. The literal idea of a critical memory is that it's represented in physical networks in the tissues of the nervous system, and that these function in the context of known theories of learning, of memory, of emotion. And the critical memory is rendered available. So this is also nice in understanding critical memory from a literal sense, that these memories are available to mechanisms of change. So we have processes for updating, not just for outcompeting them through extinction, but actually updating and changing the very meaning and nature of what these critical memories are supposed to be there for. So let's talk about integration. What does integration mean? So we think about integration as bringing the components of the core self. This is kind of a CMI term, but a lot of people can recognize it. We have a sense of this idea of core self, which is who I am consistently across time, who I am in my values, who I am and who I want to be, who I am and how I want to approach the world. As we bring that core self in contact with the critical memory, through the process of CMI, an integration potential is there. And that integration potential essentially means that the critical memory can change, it can shift, and it can come into alignment. It can fit within this idea of the core self. And these are kind of ideas or concepts that aren't unique per se to CMI. Some other therapies kind of describe these in different ways. And it's good that they do, because it's kind of that convergent validity idea that this isn't such a unique idea in human experience. We want to be doing this. Many others have discovered that this is important and useful. And so CMI does that too. CMI and integration, the idea in integration is that we move toward the critical memory with this idea of curiosity, of expanded awareness, and that's what sort of fosters the shift and the change for the integration to happen. There is the main mechanism in the integration process is called memory reconsolidation, which probably, 20 years ago, nobody had heard about it, really. I mean, it wasn't an interesting term 20 years ago, and even 10 years ago, it was probably hard to run into. I think now it's probably a little bit more common to have at least heard the idea of memory reconsolidation. If you haven't, the idea of memory reconsolidation is something just as simply as to make available to change, to make malleable some existing structure of how I remember or how I proceed or how I operate, and to update it, to change. A simple example would be if you know a word and you get a new, like an updated definition to that word, your part of your brain that holds that information can update through memory reconsolidation. It can shift and change and include new information. When we think about these critical memories, these more deeper in the nervous system memories, when they need to shift or change, there actually needs to be a bigger process that surrounds that updating. But memory reconsolidation defines that as well. And then the integration is also going to include this expanded sense of self. So this is kind of like the end result of integration, is that the individual grows, they actually increase, they become more, I would say even literal sense, they become more following the integration than what they were prior to. Like learning increases and it advances an individual, same sort of idea. It also increases the range of the individual's capacities. So the integration provides this ability for the individual to be more in more circumstances, in more contexts, in more scenarios across the different areas of life. So what are the treatment goals for CMI? What do we want to do as a therapist, a CMI therapist? So one of the first things that we focus on in the training in CMI is for the therapist to be a resource for connection. So connection is a big idea in CMI. Connection is an idea that exists as an intrapersonal phenomenon. So my ability to be in connection with myself, with these different layers of myself. But connection is also an interpersonal phenomena. And so for the therapist, they can actually provide themselves as a resource for connection through the interpersonal wavelength. That resource can be taken by the client to advance their intrapersonal connection. So we really focus on this idea of connection for the therapist. And these are ideas that are also, they're out there. These are good ideas. You see a lot with these experiential therapies are really big on this idea of the therapist as a resource for connection. But we'll get a little bit more into that later. Another goal for CMI is to develop the client's awareness of their signals. Okay, their signals. I'm just going to insert a quick definition. So what is signal? A signal is an idea that I think many readily recognize. A term that is analogous, in a way, analogous is like a trigger, right? Or an intrusive thought, or maybe a theme, or a pattern of behaving, or this extra emotion in a circumstance that didn't quite fit, and I can't figure out why or where it showed up from. Okay, so a signal defines all of these things that we recognize already, and what it is meant to do is sort of convey this idea of or if I'm the client, that I can approach this thing, this trigger, this intrusive thought, this nightmare, if you will. All of these things fall into this category of signal. And I can approach that, I can move toward it because within that signal is something of incredible value. I actually don't want to pull away from that signal. I want to move toward it. So we want to help the client, as a goal in CMI, is to develop awareness of their signals. They come back the next week and say, hey, these are the signals that showed up. Can we explore them? Can we see where they lead us to? You bet, let's go. So that's the idea of developing awareness of signal. The next is sensation and emotion expansion. This is a big vehicle in CMI for advancing the process. So we want to help the individual to move toward uncomfortable sensation, starting with sensation as sort of like a more basic or fundamental internal experience, an interoceptive experience, to advance through sensation into emotion, into the metaphor phenomena even, and to expand at each step the experience of those things. So much is gathered there as information, so much is, the integration process begins even there as well. So we want to expand sensation and emotion rather than regulate, rather than sort of develop a set of strategies for navigating. We actually want to head right into that. The next is core capacities in action. So in CMI, we've got this idea that the core self has these core capacities of fluency, which is to be able to engage with and tolerate, endure even without being disrupted or without being dissembled. The emotions, the sensations, and the cognitions that show up. So fluency is the capacity to endure those things. Agency, another core capacity, is the sense with which an individual feels that they can move toward it. That is their choice, that they're doing this, they're in charge, they're in control. And then connectability, this is kind of this idea of connection again, where they can move towards these things that they can connect with, that they often have tried to disconnect from or not been able to connect to. So we want to see those core capacities in action. We want to integrate the critical memory with the core self. I talked a little bit more about that specifically earlier. And to expand the sense of the core self and the core capacities. And that as a goal really is a result of the CMI process, that the individual increases, they develop to become more. And then that sense of growth, and that literal growth, figurative growth, it's all there, serves in an iterative way the client to continue to do these integrative processes beyond therapy, in between sessions. Eventually, I see it a lot. Folks like, yeah, I've been doing great, Brian. That's why I haven't been coming back. Like, all right, good for you. That's what I'm hoping for. So we want folks to expand those things so they can take them with us. Let's talk about the evidence base. Now, CMI in our development cycle, we're pretty early on in the development cycle. So we have, research that is in process and in progress as far as like control trials, RTCs. We don't have data for randomized controlled trials yet. So we're in the stage that we're appealing to the APA has these like different levels for evidence-based. And so what we're appealing to right now is the established research from other domains of science and therapy that say that this mechanism of action works, and here's where we know it works, and here's how we understand it, and here's the result, the outcome, sort of the effectiveness and the efficacy. So we appeal to the things that have been established, and we say these things that have been established are right here in CMI. And beyond that, we are, at a level of sort of case study and sort of individual sort of theory and case study is kind of where we're at in our development cycle. So of course, that's an ongoing process and a slow one, unfortunately. It's kind of how our industry works. But let's talk about where the evidence-based exists. So we have a lot of existing, standing on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. A lot exists out there. And some of the stuff, I'll just kind of like hit the beats. Apologies for the small font, but looking first at these ideas around defensiveness and safety. So the systems of defense, it's an idea in the nervous system. We have a nervous system that's mostly set up to protect us. And we have a nervous system that's also there to put us in a mode of safety where we can explore, where we can connect, where we can interact, where we can grow. And I mean that literally, where we can like neuronogenesis, synaptogenesis, where our brain and nervous system can actually flourish and grow. So we have mechanisms for that, and that's well defined in Porges' work with polyvagal theory, and then the dynamics of polyvagal theory in the therapy-client relationship. That's defined in Geller-Porges 2014. We've got ideas from attachment theory, and this goes back to Bowlby and Ainsworth, more recently Bretherton. And I think there are a lot of therapies out there that use attachment theory very closely. They're very closely informed by that. We also have the idea of agency and construction of the self, theories of emotion, Panksepian theories of emotion. So how are emotions installed? What different levels of emotion exist? We've got these very basic sort of affects of excitement and calm. We also have things like, that are a little bit more a step above and more rudimentary, like, seeking and pleasure and anger, etc. And then we have the ways in which our experience, our cognitive sort of conscious experience can interact with these things and come up with very sort of sophisticated and very personalized and very unique experiences of emotion. In fact, so unique that each individual you'll encounter has an experience with their emotions that's both sort of universal in a sense, but also so specific to them that only they can know what that experience is like. We could never really know what it's like. And so in that sense, CMI relies on them and their capacity to experience that as part of the path to healing. And again, processes of emotion. This is found in Greenberg's emotionally focused therapy. Memory reconsolidation, which I talked about a little bit earlier. And that's a very rich sort of neuroscience based evidence. Looking more at some of the evidence base. This is going to be coming more from the established therapies. So where the previous slide looked more at the mechanisms, these are some of the established therapies that are using a lot of things that are very similar. So some of these things folks might even already be in recognition of. Mindful awareness, mindsight, and neural integration. Dan Siegel, his stuff is all over positive psychology. You see it, DBT has it, ACT has it, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy has it. That stuff's everywhere. A lot of the third wave cognitives have that, so it's good stuff. Focusing oriented psychotherapy, and this comes from like Genlin stuff. And now we're going a little bit further back, more into some of the traditional stuff, but the ways in which the body can inform a process of healing, the way in which the body through sensation and emotion can be a path to healing. Integrative emotion regulation. Now, this is a positive psychology idea. That was a term, Stephanie, that I couldn't remember earlier. So integrative emotion regulation is this idea that's very similar to our sensory emotion expansion idea, though we do things that are distinct, which we think provide a more efficient and effective and personalized, individualized approach to that process. Then we've got emotionally focused therapy for individuals. This is Sue Johnson stuff. Again, Leslie Greenberg's emotion focused therapy, coherence therapy. This is one of the earlier therapies that really established itself as a memory reconsolidation based therapy. And CMI really uses a lot of the memory reconsolidation ideas. And of course, meaning making focused narrative oriented therapies. And this is a broad range of therapies, but it really applies to this sense in CMI that in everything that we're doing, the client is the main character, and everything we're doing in engaging with the client, it's their personal narrative. They're sort of like their own constructed narrative, their own constructed experience that matters. And so we have to get into that domain, and then the universals apply. We can't apply the universals before we're there. And so we allow them to be the hero of their journey, so to speak, and to explore their adventure in a way using these universal mechanisms, but knowing that in each case it's going to be perfectly unique and distinct to them. And so that is why they're so essential to the process. Okay, so that's some of the evidence-based stuff. I'm going to transition now here from the kind of presenting the mechanisms and the ideas of CMI to the registration and information, the logistics stuff. But I'll keep this up, and we can also kind of make a simultaneous transition to questions and answers and conversation, that sort of thing. But know that this is kind of where we're at in the presentation. So if, let's see, I should keep sharing screen, yeah? Do you think, Julia, should I keep the screen up?
Yeah,
Folks
I
can get
think
this?
so.
Okay.
And
So
hi,
no.
everyone. I
Go
didn't want
ahead.
to interrupt Brian while he was presenting, but I'm Julia, the Programs and Development Coordinator. I handle all of our trainings and registrations and getting those squared away. So post webinar, I'm happy to send you our trainings page where you will get what you're seeing on the screen as well. You can learn more about the trainings and more about CMI, and also a link to upcoming trainings we have and dates.
Okay. I just circle back, Stephanie, to your post in the chat, and just see if there's anything that you want to expand on this, or if I'd gotten to the answers to the question in a sufficient way.
Yeah, I think it definitely, there's a lot of pieces that I just was like, yep, that lines right with it. Where I think this would be a good complement to the work that I already do, especially looking at it from this perspective of expansion versus extinction. And a lot of
Right.
what I do is to like lean into the emotions, like in the ACT model, we're not avoiding, we're
Yeah.
allowing those emotions to come. So experiential avoidance is a huge thing that I work through a lot with clients. And then the focus on well-being.
Mm-hmm.
I just opened my own solo practice, and it's therapy and wellness. So it definitely
Beautiful.
aligns all together. And my company is living in alignment. So I'm like, well, this is good.
Okay. Okay.
Just like bring some of those pieces together where I don't want to do trauma work, so to speak, where it just get pigeonholed into only working with people with trauma, but everybody has something that they have a critical memory. And I loved when you were like, it doesn't have to be a traumatic experience. We all have memories that are core memories that form us into how we're relating to our relationships, how we show up in
Mm-hmm.
the world. So I think you definitely touched on the parts where I was like, are these things going to match up? Because I don't want to do something that's like very separate from what I already have a passion for, but they could
Right.
be
I
integrated.
appreciate you saying that, Stephanie. There is a lot of feedback that we're getting from folks, and even what I've noticed as well is that because CMI in its development was meant to be, so built out of like the universal human experience and like what the nervous system, like the things that would transcend even a therapeutic and these different therapeutic approaches. We're looking at the very basics. Because we started there, we I think we find because of that that it does fit in everywhere. So I've used this, I've integrated CMI with interpersonal psychotherapy, I've integrated it with acceptance and commitment therapy, with um, um, uh, cognitive processing therapy. It's a trauma-based therapy. Some of you might know. It plays even nicer with prolonged exposure. I mean, there are so many things that CMI just inserts and installs and just like becomes a connective tissue for a lot of different therapies. So that's not really one that we don't, let's say, advertise it that way, but it can be. Like you've got your preferred modality. In as much as your preferred modality has some elbow room, CMI can fit in there. It doesn't need to be as an adjunct. It stands on its own very nicely. And in fact, that's, I think, what I'm noticing folks as they come back is like, yeah, I'm just kind of doing more and more of CMI. And I've been using it with stuff, but it's just kind of getting a little bit easier, just get to it sooner. But it fits right in. And we think it fits right in. Well, I think it fits right in because of the way it's developed. It's designed to work. In fact, we just had an individual who's pretty well known and installed, at least over on the East Coast, with internal family systems therapy, so IFS, and he did a training with CMI, and the way he's found CMI integrating with IFS is so profound that he gave a talk. He did a webinar, and he said like, hey, look, this has really helped advance my work in IFS. So folks are seeing it very useful in different ways. It stands on its own, and it stands with whatever you're using. And so that's nice. I think that's a nice thing to be able to sort of assure folks that you don't need to learn something entirely new. Like EMDR can kind of be that. It's an entirely new thing. You got to do it the EMDR way, and that's okay. Some folks really benefit from that, so that's great. CMI is a little bit different. So, Sophie or Tracy, good to see you, Tracy. Thanks for being here. Any questions from either of you?
Yeah, something that I was thinking just while you were presenting is I was thinking about some of my clients who are, I guess one could say more along the kind of personality disorder continuum. Sort of what was resonating with me is this idea of, there's so much fragmentation that happens. I guess I use a lot of
Yeah.
psychodynamic and IFS and ART, and just the description with CMI about sort of the, not reintegration, I guess the
Integration or
yeah, the
reconsolidation. Yeah, yeah.
reconsolidation and sort of this, that kind of like an act, that continual core self sort of experience. And
Mhm.
so those are just thoughts like floating through my mind. And so I didn't know if you could maybe
Good.
speak to those a little bit more. It very much
Yeah.
like cognitive schema kind of vibes. I don't
So
know.
I know I like the prompt. I like that you're thinking these things. I've got experience working with more the cluster B, so kind of like the borderline, narcissist, the histrion, kind of those more volatile, sort of outward facing personality disorders. Those that we recognize, they're all sort of recognizable, but those that we see more commonly, let's say. Um, and I think it was early on in my development as a professional, I sort of installed this idea that these personality disorders are probably better thought of as like a system for survival that doesn't quite work anymore. It's like, oh, once you see it that way, it's like it's not disordered, it's just not updated, and there it's the procedural, the automatic, the subconscious mind is trying to use the same problem solving set in a new environment, and they can't interface in a successful way. And so it fits so closely with this idea of like there's a piece, a part, and this is kind of like the parts work stuff or the IFS stuff is like there's this exile, I think is how they define, that's kind of would be their stand-in for a critical memory. There's this part of them that isn't integrated. It's not interconnected with, say, who the individual sees themselves or like the ideal sense of self, where my goals and my values and the things that I want to be consistent. There's another neuro term for that, like the default mode network is this idea that like this is kind of who you are most of the time. And then when something is threatening in the environment, you move into a different zone, this kind of defensive zone where these defensive patterns show up to protect you, to keep you safe. And it's a good thing that those are there because they worked at some point. That's why they were installed. They had to be. And so what we're looking at is a way that we can access those critical parts, those critical memories, those critical experiences, even as they expand across a range of time and include this network of discrete moments and experiences. They're connected still. Now, as we begin to move into that network, as we move into it with curiosity, we move into it with connection, we move into it through that expansion. It actually changes the nature of its activation from engage as a procedure to become malleable to change. Okay, what new information? And this is just a dynamic of the nervous system. It's like, I don't need, it's funny, I use this example sometimes. You see those internet videos of like, the cucumber next to the cat, and the cat knows it and it jumps, up the ceiling. It's like, what is that? It's a little bit different, but this is something that's so ingrained and installed. It's in there. It's automatic because that cucumber used to be a snake, for thousands of years, right? And the cat jumping was like the cat living to, be a cat another day type of thing. Of course, and it's just a cucumber and it's a funny video now, but it's the same kind of ideas. Like, we have these things. And I don't want to abuse the metaphor too much, but like, we're running into cucumbers and we're acting like snakes. So we got to update that. And so these critical memories can very much be thought of as the pattern within a personality disorder, these sort of patterns of being. That's critical memory. That's there. And so we approach it all the same way. And when I say we approach it the same way, the therapist approaches it in such a way that the client is at the lead and they're advancing the exploration through the experience of expanded sensation, expanded emotion, expanded metaphor, expanded, internal experience. So they explore the territory. And because they're exploring the territory, they're activating all the constituent parts of that network. And that's what makes it available to update. So we, the therapists, could never know what's all in there in that network. A personality disorder, it defines a bigger network of critical memory than, say, the threat to life that happened while I was deployed in Ramadi, right? That's kind of a different thing. And we recognize it as such, though the idea of exploring and mapping out that critical memory is the same, because it's either the soldier's trauma incident or the soldier's personality. They're taking the lead. I work in the VA, so I'll use the veteran as my stand-in. They're taking the lead to map this out, to explore it, and to integrate it. And the therapist provides this space and this resource that they can move through that mapping out process. And so when it's more complex and there are more constituent parts to the critical memory, it may take more time. Personality disorders are sort of notoriously difficult for people to heal from. Well, there's a lot there. There's a lot of healing to do. There's a lot of updating to do. That's fair. But the CMI process provides that roadmap, that blueprint for integrating all of that critical memory stuff. But yeah, good prompt. I appreciate that, Sophie. Good thinking.
Yeah, and thank you for that kind of
connecting
all of those dots and like translating it into this kind of language. So
Brilliant. Well, have I evoked any other questions or curiosities from the group? Maybe there's some specific things that Julia might answer logistically.
I have a question about, this is kind of like the early stages. I think of like in the 80s and 90s when Stephen Hayes and everybody was just developing ACT, right? So like, is that kind of where CMI is at right now, where you're in the 80s and 90s stage of like gathering information development?
Yeah.
And where do you envision this going? So I'm already thinking like, I work primarily with women. That's the kind of the niche that I have. And like some of them have had traumatic birth experiences, and like that
Yeah.
affects the way that they attach to their children. Or my husband's in law enforcement.
Yep.
And the way that they do their debriefings, I'm like, this is a joke. So
Yeah. I'm glad you
like
see it
all
as a
different
joke.
kinds of
Yeah,
things
yeah,
that,
yeah.
where do you see this going, the ultimate, and you work at the VA, so
No, this is a great question. I mean, I'll try to um, yeah, I'll govern my response here a little bit as best I can. Um, and yeah, Sophie's still here. She just is off screen. That's okay. So let's answer the first part of that question first. So the process that Hayes went through in the 80s and 90s, and really everyone has had to go through up until now, has been one of sort of like it kind of born out of the academia universe and world, and there's a process, and so oftentimes well, you look at it, there's like a development cycle that's like a decade long for just about, I mean, it's on average, a lot of therapies are like this. Now what's useful, what's interesting is that okay, I'll use an analogy. Like writing a paper used to take not a decade, but like you're banging on a typewriter, it takes time. You know, it used to take more time. So like the advances in technology is something that is going to benefit the development cycle of CMI and sort of shorten that already. CMI has also been and Arise, the nonprofit sort of like parent nonprofit entity under which CMI is developed. They're an existing structure too, with an existing sort of network. So there's like resources that we got off the ground very quickly. So we weren't in a at a research lab at a university, just tinkering with this stuff and trying to use it as a way to advance graduate students into their dissertations type of thing. The mission was very different: is get the product developed and out to the user as quickly as possible. The user being the therapist, so that they can affect these mechanisms of change to the end user, the client, is like expedite that. So we're about 2 years and change into our development cycle. But it's advanced because of the technologies. It's also advanced because we can look to see how others have done it and not have all those oblique angles, straight shot through those things at work. And so that's what's been our focus, is to get it to market quickly. As we get it to market, we're also developing the research side simultaneously, and that's a lot of the responsibilities I've taken on. So we've got those irons running too. And so I think for some, they're like, well, I need to see the research first. Got it, understand. And some people are like, nope, I already know this is true because I've experienced it in some way in my practice already. So show me what you got to offer. I think where a lot of people are getting that, and they're getting through the training, they're getting out there, the feedback we're getting from them that's an iterative process for the development too. So in some way, it's like, and here's an analogy that I don't think is that far off. The research cycle on, I think, aspirin, these are like decades long research cycles. But they said like, hey, like something like 2% of the people who take this don't have these myocardial infarctions, as heart attacks. We need to get this out now because it'll actually save lives. And so like there's precedent for saying like, this is so useful, we just need to get it out before all of the RTCs are done. And so part of that was looking at like, what are the risks, and with the therapy, the risks are, not the same as a pharmaceutical. So getting it out to market it has been a priority, but that is not at the expense of the priority of developing the data, so the research, like what are we coming back with? Now, along those lines, and kind of noting our time, there has been, so some of the things that fed into CMI does have a bit of a research base, and that's some of the things that I've brought with me. And so there's some unpublished manuscript right now that I have shared with folks who are curious about like main effect, like what happens to a group of 20 veterans who have all been diagnosed with PTSD, and they go through this sort of experiential process. Let's see the main effects on those. And you've got PCL5, the PTSD clinic scale 5, deltas of like 20 or more points. In some cases, 25 or 30 points. So we're seeing main effects of like, and so like a 10-point delta, like so symptom reduction, 10 points, that's clinically significant. If you get 20 points, you know, you're doubling that, so that sort of thing. So there is something that's working here that we know. And then we're also seeing it on the eaches. As each clinician is going out and doing it, they're coming back and saying it's working, or I need more here, I need some updates. Okay, so that's kind of the first part of the question. The next part, I think we lost Tracy, that's okay, because we are running up on time. Where we see CMI going, I want it in the VA, that's kind of a personal mission, or one that I'm taking kind of the point on. We want to get it into the VA. We want to get it out to the masses as broadly as we can. Because it integrates so well, we can partner up, and there's some possibility that we can partner up with some of the existing sort of like Kate Shard and the clinical or the clinical processing therapy, cognitive processing therapy. So that's kind of like the main Cadillac PTSD therapy. So there might be some team ups there. We're also looking at getting our trainings going, and we're coast to coast right now, but like growing the number of trainings. So like that's kind of the main thrust of our focus right now, is growing the access and of this. Manuscripts, publications, books, all of this stuff is down the road. Right now it's the main thrust of our energy is getting folks in, getting them trained, so that good in the world can be done, and that's what we're seeing. But that is, again, not at the expense of what is necessary, which is to say, here's all the data, here are the books, here are the manuscripts, here's what the VA, and there's a lot of projects, a lot of things that are up and going, and we've already been international. We've been in different places. We're working with the military and some folks out in Germany. So there are other things that are going on too, to advance our mission. But it is so important that we can just get this to the user right away, so that the end user can benefit from that. So I appreciate the questions. Very good. Okay, well, we're kind of up at time. I appreciate your time, the both of you, and I think Tracy, who was here but has since left. Did the contact, okay, here's the last slide that I'm just going to put in front. Here's some contact information. There's the website, so that's just arisealliance.org. The info at Arise Alliance is a email, and then there's a phone number there. Yeah, my instinct is always to kind of go to the website so I can kind of navigate it at my own pace, but grab some of that and stay in contact. Any questions, send it out. We make these webinars available as well, and so we distribute that. I'm not actually sure the mechanism of that distribution, and Julia popped off. She had another meeting to get to. So again, I appreciate your time. If you need anything else from us, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
This is awesome.
Take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.